Good day, everybody. I hope this finds you well. Today we're going to talk a bit about culture. And culture is an aspect that impacts just about any organization, any entity, any country, any place in which we live, any place in which we work. Culture affects management and organizations, leadership and employees, customers and vendors. Culture is one of those pervasive concepts that unless we understand what culture is, and unless we understand the impact of culture on our organization, it could greatly, both positively and negatively, impact our world. For those reasons, whether we study evaluations or organizational development, ethics, human resources, whatever our topic may be, a clean and clear understanding of ethics and its relation to culture, culture and its relation to leadership, leadership and its relations to organizations. It's grounded in understanding the environment of which we work, culture. So we want to spend a couple minutes understanding culture so that then when we determine a strategy, when we determine a process, when we turn an action on where we want to go, even what we want to be from a personal viewpoint, we can ensure that we take into account culture in what we do. So what is culture? Culture is the accumulated sharing learnings that we have in a certain group. It could be behavioral, emotional, cognitive. The best way to ever define and understand culture, it's the way we do things around here. Simply the way we do things around here. When we talk about the accumulated shared learnings of a given group, that means that culture is specific to where you're at or where you work. For instance, if you work at the post office, you have a certain culture. If you work at Google, you have a certain culture. It's fair to say that if you work at Google, it's a different culture than working at the post office. Here's just some examples where this behavioral, emotional, and cognitive comes into mind. If you work at the post office, you're going to have a job and you're going to have an industry for as long as the post office exists. It has for hundreds of years. Google may not exist the next 10 years. Google hasn't been in business that long. Probably maybe a tenth as long as the post office, if that. And before Google, there was a company that did something similar. There may be something after Google. At one point, there was MySpace that was the social network that we all utilized. Now what we see is that it's now Facebook. Facebook is now trying to be Meta. And there may be something after that. We've seen that the number of people using Facebook has declined. Because culture is different no matter where you work. And in that way, we have to understand the culture in which we work. Only then can we determine whether that's a place we want to work, that's a place we want to shop, that's a place that we want to spend a considerable amount of our time with. So if you're in Google, it's probably much more of a fast-paced type organization. What you did last year may not be something that you do next year. As a result of that, there's a high degree of innovation and creativity that occurs within Google. Maybe even a high degree of energy and enthusiasm. Very energetic place to work. The opposite can be said for the post office. In fact, the post office has done the same thing, delivering mail, for the past 10, 50, 100, even 200 years. The process may be slightly different. They may not, in fact, deliver it by horse and buggy. They may use planes to deliver quite a bit of the mail. However, they still do the same thing, which is take a physical product from one person and deliver it to another person. This is not to say they don't do it well and there's not some great benefits in what they do. What it does mean is that it's quite similar in what they've done for hundreds of years. So if you want to work at a post office, it's a very static type job. There's not much change in what they do. It's repetitive. And if you're interested in that type of work, that would be a great place for you to work. But if you're interested in a job that has a high degree of excitement, what you're doing this month may not be doing what you're what you're doing next month. And there's a continual evolution of products and services. That would be Google. That would be Apple. Even though the Apple Watch and the iPhone has been around for some time, there's no doubt that there's something new that's coming up that they're working on now that may upend the very nature of the work in which people do. That's culture. It's the way we do things around here. One other example I'll give about culture from a personal viewpoint. If you have relatives that live in a different state, or certainly just a different city, but even if they live in the same city, you'll find that if you go in their house, it is different than your house. Even though you may come from the same family, or even if there's friends that you have. There's differences in the way that people live. One easy example is eating times. You'll find a few people that eat at the same time. Some people like to eat quite early, 4 and 5 o'clock. Some people like to eat quite late, 8 and 9 o'clock. And so for those reasons, the way we do things around here is, well, dinner around here is about 6 o'clock. Maybe we do our homework first, and then we wash up for dinner, and then we have dinner. Another good example about dinner is the culture of one home may be that they sit around a table and talk about their day. The culture of another home may be that everybody eats in front of the TV and they watch one of their favorite shows. I remember when our children were younger, every Friday used to be pizza night, and we would get pizza every Friday night. That was just the kind of the culture in which we did. Other families may have done something different, but that's something that somewhat defined the way that we lived. So that gives you a good background on culture. If you're looking at, for instance, evaluations, some cultures may be that we give evaluations in an organization every month, some every quarter, some semi-annually, some annually. So other organizations may not use evaluations. So you can see how there's differences within organizations, just using one example being performance evaluations. No matter who we are or what we do, who we meet or where we go, there's good along the roads we travel if only we choose to look for it. This is a great quote that we use when we talk about culture, because culture is about differences. And in our world, one of the primary words that we're learning is about differences, diversity. The word that's often used is diversity, equity, inclusion. And that's really a fairly new word, although we've taught some variation of that probably for 20 years in the terms of ethics. Ethics is right and wrong conduct, and what's ethical is that we treat people better than they treat us. Not the same, but better. There's some people that treat us terribly, and if we follow in some way the golden rule of treating people like they treat us, that means that we would treat them terribly. But kind of a variation of that is we should always treat people better. This quote really talks about that as we learn about different cultures, about the way people live, or about the way that organizations operate, we're going to come up to this word which is called differences, and people are going to act and react, live and work differently. And so we have to be not only respectful of that, but we have to be in some ways enthralled with the way people live. I often tell people that if we go on vacation, we don't want to see the same thing every time. It's always better to go to a different country. Even if you go to the same country, go see something different. And that's what diversity is. There's very few people that wear the same clothes or eat at the same restaurant. And they don't because they want some excitement and interest in their life. So diversity is similar in that you can take different vacations to far off places in the world. We don't go to the same place. It's the same with people. People who have a different philosophy, viewpoint, and outlook on life, who have different backgrounds, and it manifests itself in the way that they talk to us or act with us. That can be terribly exciting because you're learning from someone who's lived a different life. As a result of that learnings, then we're not only enthralled with those differences, but we educate ourselves on something that's different. And so these differences can be of great interest, but also can cause anxiety. And this is why there's a great quote which says that in some ways, the more you travel, the less you're aware of, or the more you're aware of. So that the quote that I wanted to use is travel is fatal to prejudice. And that was from a guy by the name of Thomas Sowell, who's a teacher at Stanford University. Travel is fatal to prejudice. It's kind of the same concept about cultures, is if you're aware of, if you interact with different individuals who live in different countries, if you work in different organizations, you become more aware of these differences, and you're less afraid, even intimidated by what you see. Those are all very positive aspects. And that's really what we want, is we want to be able to spend our time traveling, meeting, working with other organizations and other vendors, because this exposure, this broadening of exposure that we have, will allow us to understand more about an organization, more about ourselves, more about the world, and as a result, we're going to be able to interact in many more instances, and that is going to allow us to be a more decent and honorable person, but also a more successful business, because we're aware of so much that occurs in life, we're less intimidated by what occurs in life, and we're able to build our business with that as a background. How culture develops. It develops from three sources. So if we were to go to England or to Japan or to Saudi Arabia, they all have different cultures. And so how do we find out what the culture is of that country? There's obviously some certain aspects that we would want to do that make quite a bit of sense. One is we would ask individuals. We would study that country. Those are probably the best ways to do it. Someone who's been to those countries, but also somebody who has in some way read quite a bit about the way things operate. There's some examples of, in some countries, it's considered rude to talk to somebody very closely. It's considered rude if you don't exchange business cards. So there's so many of these variances that we want to learn if we want to interact with others in a different culture. No, we shouldn't expect them to adapt to our life. If we're going into their country or their organization, we should adapt to the expectations that they have there. Doesn't mean that we fully support or even believe in the way that they live their life. In fact, in some cases we may not. But it does mean that we have to respect the arenas in which we visit. And it's almost like going into somebody's home. You see something that you don't like. You may not necessarily, unless it's something that's clearly offensive, but it may not be something that you may raise in their own home because that's the way that they live that life. In general, culture develops from three sources. Beliefs, values, what they believe. A value is something that's important to them. So it could be, in some ways, those are those values. I often think of it as on the wall. So these statements that are on the wall when you walk into a home or even an organization. These beliefs or values. Some examples for me, we have one in our home that says, work hard, be kind, and never give up. So our value and the way we try to live our life is to work hard, be kind, and never give up. In an organization, these beliefs and values manifest themselves often in what's called a code of ethics, which usually centers around a couple of variables, which is fairness, some kind of respect. So those are two probably of the most important, a sense of fairness and a sense of respect. And the last is a sense of some type of truth, honesty. So when you go into many, most, if not all organizations, hopefully, they have certain values that define the way that those that interact with the organization are expected to follow. Those are often written down, by the way, so you actually see them. The second part that we learn about the culture, again, now that we've talked to people and then we've read some of the materials, is these learning experiences of group members as the world evolves. And this often is the difference between formal conversations and informal conversations, almost like gossip. The second aspect is kind of like gossip, which is, okay, we have these code of ethics that are written on the wall. We have these personal ethics that are written on the wall. But then you talk to people and say, but do people really follow those? And you may find out that they don't. So although, as a good example, an organization may say something like, customers are the most important component of our success, or they may say, our employees are our strength, but yet they don't treat employees well. So their beliefs and values may say something about employees are the most important aspect of our organization. But when you talk to individuals in that organization, you may learn that, that's not really true. They don't treat us that way. In fact, they treat us quite terribly. And so that's the second part of understanding culture, is you see what's written down, and the second part is, well, do they actually follow that? You may hear this example of they talk the talk, but do they walk the walk? And you may find out that that's not true. And the last part about how culture develops, and this could be positive, is that new members like yourself, if you go into an organization or even into a home or a community, and you change the way that the organization operates or the community operates just by virtue of who you are and how influential you've become. And this is where new people come in. We often use the term new blood. And just that, this just means somebody who's new, who hasn't been steeped in that type of culture, comes in and said, hey, you do things differently, which we respect, but would you consider a different way to do it? It may be more beneficial to you all as an organization. You hope that you work in an organization that allows itself to be changed or modified by new individuals that come into the organization or to the community. And so you'll see that an organization will question what it stands for. It'll question its future. And it questions whether what they've believed in the past, which have got them to where they are, will necessarily allow them to continue to progress in the future. Those that don't change the way in which they operate may find out that their customers have changed, but they haven't. So you may lose your customer. So having new people come into an organization can be highly positive. Turnover and retention often looked as negative. If you have a high retention and maybe a low turnover, some people may say that's very positive. But you may have a dearth of ideas because it's the same type of people who've always worked there. Given that, again, our world is changing, our customers are changing, we need an organization that changes as well, and that may be bringing in new people into the organization. So what does culture do in our organization? And to use an example of an organization that, for instance, would have evaluations on a yearly basis, or let's say on a quarterly basis, they want to make sure that the individual who works there is meeting the expectations of the position. That really is a function of culture. Is this person doing what we expect them to do? Remember, culture is the way we do things around here. So by doing evaluations, you're assessing whether that employee at that time is meeting the expectations that a supervisor, a manager, a leader has conveyed to that employee. So an evaluation is one tool that we use to not only strengthen the culture of the organization, but make sure that it represents what the leaders of that organization expect that it should. Ideally, if culture has a couple of specific functions. First is it creates distinctions between people. And then it creates a sense of identity. So those are the first two, and let's talk about them in a bit more detail. Creates distinctions between people. One of the easiest ways to determine this is if some people are in one high school in a town and some are another. By being part of those high schools, you have a specific culture. And that culture, going into the second one, gives you an identity. So it's quite clear to understand, oh, you went to that college, you went to that high school, you work at that organization. There was an organization some years ago by the name of Enron. And Enron was one of the top organizations in the United States, they ended up going out of business because of some ethical lapses. Anybody working for Enron will have that distinction among those people who work there. If you put on your resume that I worked at Enron, it was hard for many people to get another job because it was seen as a very unethical company. So culture creates these distinctions between people. It could be positive, but it could be negative as well. Clothing is a good example to highlight these distinctions. There's people who spend quite a bit of money on clothing, and they may want a horse or a moose, whatever it may be, on their shirt, and that details how much money they spent for that clothing. And if you have the right emblem, it could mean that you spent $200, $300, $400, $500 on a shirt, and that creates a distinction. People are trying to give an image, and it flows into the second one, which is why I've combined these. It creates a sense of identity. If you're in college and you're a member of some sorority or fraternity, as an example, or just any club in a city, it does create an identity. Oh, you're with that group. People have an image right off the bat. Third, it facilitates a commitment to something larger than one's individual self-interest. So if you join, a good example with some clubs, the Lions Club is a social organization. The Rotary Club is a business club, and they usually give quite a bit of money to charity. Not only do they help the organizations themselves, because they're usually comprised of individuals who work at businesses or have some interest in the town, but it conveys this sense that we're doing something more than just promoting ourselves. There are some organizations that work directly with the poor, some that work with the homeless. And so by being part of that organization, by being part of that culture within that organization, it states that I'm not just here for my own self, I'm also here for others as well. And last, it really is this kind of social glue that holds people together, and it provides standards. So this is probably the most important aspect of culture, is that if you want to be part of our group, then this is the way that we expect you to act. And it could be something as simple as we treat every person we come into contact with a high degree of kindness. And that could be the social glue. Anybody part of that group is known for the kindness that they exhibit towards each other and to others outside of the group. But it is the standards, the expectations. My son is an engineer, and he's part of an engineering association. And as a result of that, there are certain standards that he has to follow. So if you're in the engineering association, you know everybody who's in that has to follow their standards of conduct. And so that's the culture that they have. Oh, you're part of that association? Well, I know that you have to follow these types of standards. That's part and parcel of you being part of that group. So if culture has a definitive function in our organizations as a result of following these cultures, then you give yourself an identity, but it also is binding. It's a binding contract between you and others within that culture. If I can, as an aside, especially for managers or leaders who go into another organization, sometimes they hire outside an organization because that organization isn't working. They need somebody to come in and identify what's not working. Ideally, if the organization was functioning properly, then they would continue to promote people from within, because that means that the organization is working. When organizations somewhat go to the outside or outside the organization to hire a high-level person, it's because there's something usually in the organization that they're trying to fix. Or maybe they don't feel that they're getting the type of ideas that are necessary when you have an individual who's associated with other organizations. So that's an aspect where you want to make sure that your culture is binding, so that it creates identity amongst people, but also it allows it the flexibility to grow and morph. As the world changes, your specific culture should change as well. How do I identify a culture? There's a couple ways that we can identify. And one is to see it, one is to read it, and one is what we call common assumptions. We talked a little bit about this earlier, so I'm just going to spend a minute or two on this. We identify culture by what we see and hear, and then the second is we really try to read it. But the most important aspect of identifying culture is the way things really operate. And that's where you hear people say something to the effect of, yeah, that's what they say, and that's what you read. But let me tell you, that never happens. And a good example of this is starting times. At some organizations, quite a few that I've been affiliated with, they expect employees to get there at 8 o'clock. However, some employees may not get there till 8:10 or 8:15. And you find out very quickly if they want you there at 8, as they said they do, or if they're pretty lax, is the term. And as long as you get there by 8:15, you're fine. So you may see or hear that they want you there at 8. You may read on the wall that we expect you to be here at 8. But most everybody just kind of comes in at about 8:15, and that's the common assumption. That's the way that things really operate. Of those three aspects, the most important, certainly identifying culture through the common assumptions. Which leads us to those organizations that may be culture challenged. And to identify whether an organization is culture challenged, you're going to look at certain aspects. The first is, and culture challenged means that the way we do things around here is not working. There's something missing. There's a part that is missing within the chain of events that at the end creates an organization that works or a community works. And that's where a culturally challenged organization, a community, has some aspect that needs to be investigated, researched, and hopefully addressed and corrected. If you treat individuals as interchangeable, then that restricts an individual of really making a commitment to the organization because they don't feel like they're needed. More importantly, they don't feel as if they're valued. And so as a result of those two things, of need and value, people don't feel a part of the organization. If you don't feel part of an organization, here's the key point, you're probably not going to devote yourself being as loyal to that organization. You don't feel included. If there's too many layers of control, when you control a person, which is, not just physically, but maybe even emotionally, if you make sure they have to be here at a certain time and they have to work in this office, they can't say things to certain people. It's a very closed-in, cloistered type of workplace. Then that inhibits thought. It inhibits creativity. And so you're going to have challenges with your culture if you're not allowing a person to express who they are, where they want to be, where they want to go. You hope that you find somebody who believes in your mission, believes in your vision because it's aligned with theirs, which means that you have to not treat people as individuals that are interchangeable. And you can't have too many layers of control where you suppress a person from doing and being what they want to be. The third one is not just teams with unfocused missions, but also individuals. Teams are important. Are they critical in an organization? It depends on the organization itself. But if you have inadequate efforts within a team or within your organization to assimilate, to bring people together, this usually starts when a person's hired. If a person's hired and they're not welcome into the organization, not just by their supervisor, but others as well, then that person may not feel included. If they don't feel included, they're certainly not going to give their best efforts. What you own, you tend to treat better. What you own, you tend to want to improve. And if people coming into an organization don't feel that they have an ownership aspect, if they don't feel like they have an ownership in the future of that organization, even if they don't own a part of the building or a part of the organization, they feel like they're a key part of the success. If they don't feel that, they're not going to invest as much in themselves about the future. And leads us to, we talked about the challenge of organizations that are culturally challenged, but let's flip that around and talk about, well, how do you create an organization then that has what we call cultural excellence? And there's a couple of aspects that I would highlight. First is you really need to learn about the culture, and you need to learn about the way things operate around here. The important part is we don't have to agree with the way things operate. We just have to be aware of the things that operate. And at this point, I would really emphasize that we have to, there's a couple expressions. Is it a battle? Is it a hill? And that really means that you may see a part of a culture and you may not agree with it. But is it that critical that you address it and try to in some ways change it? Just because something is not the way that you would do it or not the way that you would say it doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. It also doesn't mean that it's necessarily something that either you have to get involved with or that needs to be changed. It may just be different. And different is great. We like different throughout our world. But you have to ask yourself, is this a hill? Is this important for me and my future that I need to address that? If it is, by all means, you want to stand up and take a stand. But if not, it may just be an issue that you have a genuine disagreement on, but it's not something that is going to dramatically impact your future or your ability to create your future. So learn about your culture, and then you have to figure out, as we talked about, we want to assess and adapt to what works. The best organizations, the best communities are those that take a look at themselves and their organization and say, this has worked, and it's worked in the past, but we don't believe it's going to work in the future. Calling our customers and asking how happy they are may have worked in the past, but today most people want to text. Texting is the highest form of communication that we have today, meaning the most prominent. In fact, some in the younger generation don't really even follow emails that much, which surprises some in the older generation who are raised that emails are really the preferred contact. So if you send emails to people, including my kids, they often don't read them. And so it's quite interesting about how the changes in the way we communicate. So talking about assessing and adapting is part of your strategy with your customers, and your customers are fairly young. If you want to communicate with them using this type of form, it may not work because that's not something that they utilize as part of their culture. We want to make sure that we welcome something new. And I bring that comment about traveling. When our kids were younger, we used to take them throughout the country every summer. And they've seen and visited almost every state. There's ways, especially when you're younger, that you can travel that doesn't cost a lot of money. It depends on where you stay and what you eat. But you can certainly see quite a bit of the world. And the United States is a fairly big country. There's other huge countries as well. And so if you get in a car and just travel about, you're going to be confronted with, even within your own country, many different ways in which people live and work. And it's a fundamentally interesting endeavor to meet people with different backgrounds who have different ambitions, and then see how different they are than you, even if they only live an hour or 2 or 5 hours from you. Those differences can become quite profound. But you want to be a person that's quite welcome to new people and new situations. If we expect people to welcome us in a certain way, we have to welcome others as well. You can see why we talk about culture, because culture really is about diversity and equity and inclusion. It really is about an organization that assesses their employees through the performance evaluation process, through the recruitment process, whatever process it is, to find out the best employees that would work well in this organization, but then also get a sense on what are employees today looking for? What are their ambitions in this job and others, and how can we change the way in which we operate as an organization to ensure that our employees are interested in where we want to go, and that maybe some of the aspects of our organization that don't work as well, we modify. I think we should follow and appreciate what I've called the circle of culture, which is that we have differences within people, which is great, and each difference is unique. It's fantastic to see something that's unique. What makes people who are unique so important is that they're interesting. It's like walking out of your house, and if all you saw was cement, there's not much interest there. But if you saw 6 or 8 different kinds of flowers, it's quite interesting, and that interest turns into fun. So you can see how culture can manifest itself by the difference that we see, which are so unique, and that uniqueness makes it interesting, and that interest gives a sense of adventure or fun to us in our lives. And so what we learn from culture is that if you can dream, sacrifice for it, risk for it, and work for it, then you have a chance to make it. You want to work in an organization and you want to be in a community that you can dream what you want to dream, and then you're going to work for it. Dreams and determination are the determining factors of success in our world. You've got to dream something different, but you got to be determined to achieve it. And you want to work in a culture that allows you to strive for your own ambitions, to see if you can make it. And if you can, you just might change the culture in your organization to be a bit better than when you first found it. Hope everybody has an enjoyable day. Take care.